Lecture 14, Contemporary Conflicts, War, Geopolitics, Intervention, and Global Transformation. Introduction, Conflict as a Driver of Global Transformation. Contemporary international politics is being reshaped by multiple conflicts, occurring at the same time. These conflicts are not isolated crises. They interact with one another and transform global power relations, alliance systems, economic networks, energy markets, migration patterns, military technology, and international institutions. The Russia-Ukraine war has transformed European security and revived large-scale interstate war in Europe. The Venezuela crisis has raised questions about sovereignty, intervention, authoritarian rule, economic collapse, and regional instability. Iran and the wider Middle East reveal how nuclear politics, proxy warfare, energy security, and regional rivalries can escalate into broader confrontation. At the center of these conflicts is the changing role of the United States, which must balance military power, alliance management, economic pressure, domestic constraints, and strategic competition with China and Russia. The main argument of this lecture is that contemporary conflicts are not merely temporary disruptions. They are practical arenas in which the global order is being reorganized. Through war and crisis, states test power, institutions reveal their limits, alliances are redefined, and new geopolitical patterns emerge. 1. Current U.S. Foreign policy strategy in a changing world. Current U.S. Foreign policy operates in a world defined by strategic competition, regional instability, and domestic political pressure. The United States remains the most powerful state in the international system, but it faces a more fragmented and contested environment than in the post-Cold War era. Its foreign policy must respond simultaneously to China's rise, Russia's war in Ukraine, instability in the Middle East, migration and political crisis in Latin America, climate-related insecurity, and technological competition. The first major feature of U.S. foreign policy is the return of great power competition. China is viewed as the most serious, long-term competitor because of its economic scale, technological capacity, military modernization, and ambition to reshape regional and global rules. Russia, meanwhile, is treated as a revisionist power because of its invasion of Ukraine and its challenge to European security. This means that U.S. strategy is no longer based mainly on counterterrorism, as it was after September 11th, but on competition among major powers. The second feature is alliance management. The United States depends on NATO in Europe, bilateral alliances in Asia, and strategic partnerships in the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. However, allies increasingly ask whether U.S. commitments are reliable. The war in Ukraine, tensions with Iran, and U.S. domestic political polarization have all increased uncertainty about long-term American leadership. Analysts have noted that U.S. foreign policy in 2026 faces major tests involving alliances, Ukraine, China, and Iran diplomacy. The third feature is economic statecraft. The United States increasingly uses sanctions, export controls, investment screening, tariffs, financial restrictions, and technology controls as instruments of foreign policy. These tools are especially visible in policy toward Russia, China, Iran, and Venezuela. Economic power has become a form of strategic power. The fourth feature is selective intervention. The United States is less willing to engage in open-ended nation-building, but it still uses military force, coercive diplomacy, sanctions, intelligence support, and security partnerships when it sees major strategic interests at stake. This creates a foreign policy that combines restraint in some areas with sharp escalation in others. 2. Russia-Ukraine. War, and geopolitics. The Russia-Ukraine war is one of the most important geopolitical conflicts of the 21st century. It is not only a war between Russia and Ukraine. It is also a conflict over sovereignty, territorial integrity, European security, NATO's role, energy politics, and the future of the international order. Russia's invasion challenged the principle that borders cannot be changed by force. For Ukraine, the war is a struggle for national survival and sovereignty. For Russia, the war is connected to its desire to prevent Ukraine's full integration into Western institutions and to restore influence over what it considers its strategic neighborhood. For Europe and NATO, the war is a test of deterrence and collective security. The war has reshaped NATO. Before the war, some observers questioned NATO's long-term purpose. After the invasion, NATO regained strategic relevance. European states increased defense spending, strengthened eastern defenses, and deepened military support for Ukraine. The war also encouraged Finland and Sweden to move toward NATO integration, showing how Russian aggression produced the opposite of Moscow's intended effect. Militarily, the war has become a grinding conflict. Recent European Council library summaries note that Ukraine has survived the fourth year of war, held defensive lines, and prevented frontline collapse, while Russia maintained initiative and intensified attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure during winter 2025-2026. CSIS analysis similarly describes the war as a grinding struggle and notes that Russian territorial gains since early 2024 have remained limited despite the enormous costs of the war. The war has also transformed modern warfare. Drones, satellite intelligence, cyber operations, electronic warfare, long-range missiles, air defense, and information warfare are now central. The battlefield is no longer only physical. It is also digital, economic, and psychological. Civilian infrastructure, energy grids, ports, railways, and communication systems have become strategic targets. Geopolitically, the war has deepened the division between Russia and the West. Sanctions have weakened Russia's access to Western finance and technology, but Russia has adapted by increasing ties with China, Iran, North Korea, and parts of the global South. This shows that sanctions can impose costs, but do not automatically force strategic surrender. The war also reveals the limits of international institutions. The UN Security Council cannot act decisively when a permanent member is directly involved in aggression. International law can condemn aggression, but enforcement depends on power and political will. 3. Venezuela. Crisis economy, politics, and international intervention. The Venezuela crisis is a complex case of economic collapse, authoritarian politics, migration, resource dependence, sanctions, and international intervention. Venezuela has some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world, yet it has experienced severe economic contraction, hyperinflation, institutional breakdown, mass migration, and political repression. The roots of the crisis are both domestic and international. Domestically, Venezuela suffered from overdependence on oil, weak institutions, corruption, mismanagement, politicization of state enterprises, and authoritarian consolidation. When oil prices fell and economic mismanagement deepened, the state lost the capacity to provide basic goods and services. Politically, the concentration of power, weakening of democratic institutions, repression of opposition forces, and disputed elections damaged domestic legitimacy. Internationally, sanctions and diplomatic isolation intensified the crisis. The United States and several regional actors accused the Maduro government of authoritarian rule, corruption, and human rights abuses. At the same time, Russia, China, Iran, and other actors maintained various forms of engagement with Caracas. As a result, Venezuela became not only a domestic crisis, but also a geopolitical arena. Recent reporting and analysis describe a dramatic escalation in U.S. involvement in Venezuela in early 2026, including claims that U.S. military intervention reshaped Venezuelan politics and pushed Caracas to reconnect with international financial institutions, such as the IMF and World Bank. The International Crisis Group also describes the early 2026 U.S. action to seize Nicolas Maduro and his wife as a new stage in Venezuela's prolonged crisis. The Venezuela case raises several major questions in international relations. First, when does humanitarian suffering justify external intervention? Second, who has the authority to recognize or reject a government? Third, can sanctions pressure authoritarian regimes, or do they worsen the suffering of ordinary people? Fourth, does intervention restore democracy, or can it deepen instability and dependency? Economically, Venezuela illustrates the danger of resource dependence. Oil wealth can finance development, but it can also create corruption, rent-seeking, weak diversification, and authoritarian patronage. 4. Iran and regional conflict dynamics. Iran is central to Middle Eastern conflict dynamics. Because of its nuclear program, regional alliances, missile and drone capabilities, energy position, and rivalry with the United States, Israel, and several Gulf states, Iran's regional strategy combines conventional defense, asymmetric warfare, proxy networks, missile deterrence, cyber capabilities, and ideological influence. Iran's influence extends through relationships with Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and other non-state actors. This gives Tehran strategic depth and allows it to pressure adversaries without always engaging in direct conventional war. However, this strategy also increases the risk of escalation because local conflicts can become regional crises.